Have you ever wondered if the devil can truly possess a person to the point of turning them into a killer? What you're about to hear is not fiction, not a horror movie. It's a real case that shocked the United States in 1981 and forever changed how we view the boundaries between faith, justice, and the supernatural. This is the story of Arne Cheyenne Johnson, the first man in the history of American jurisprudence to use demonic possession as a legal defense in a murder trial. A story so incredible that it inspired movies, documentaries, and debates that continue to this day. Before continuing with this fascinating and disturbing story, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave your like on this video. Your support is fundamental so I can continue bringing you quality content about cases that challenge our understanding of reality. I also want to know your opinion on this controversial topic, so don't forget to leave your comment at the end of the video. The story we're about to tell begins in a small Connecticut town called Brookfield, where an apparently normal family, the Glatzels, lived. But in the summer of 1980, something changed drastically in their lives when David Glatzel, barely 11 years old, began experiencing phenomena that defied all logical explanation. The boy started speaking in languages he had never learned, predicting future events with terrifying precision, and demonstrating superhuman physical strength that left everyone present completely bewildered. His parents, Carl and Judy Glatzel, felt desperate when they couldn't find a medical explanation for their son's behavior, who had gone from being a happy, normal child to becoming someone completely unrecognizable. David's episodes weren't simple childhood pranks or common psychological problems. The boy began experiencing terrifying visions in which he saw demonic creatures that threatened him and promised to harm both him and his family. During these episodes, David would enter deep trance states where his voice changed completely, becoming deep and threatening, speaking with knowledge that went beyond his years. The family was completely terrified when David began revealing intimate secrets of people he had never met and describing in detail historical events that a child his age couldn't possibly know. The situation became so desperate that the Glatzels decided to seek spiritual help, contacting the famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who already had an established reputation for their investigations of supernatural cases. The Warrens, after evaluating the situation, concluded that David was genuinely possessed by demonic entities and needed immediate exorcism. The Warrens' decision wasn't taken lightly, as they had investigated thousands of supposedly paranormal cases and had confirmed only a few as authentic demonic possessions. During the preliminary investigations, the Warrens documented extraordinary phenomena that occurred in David's presence, including objects that moved without explanation, temperatures that dropped drastically without apparent cause, and inexplicable sounds that seemed to come from the walls of the house itself. Lorraine Warren, who claimed to have clairvoyant abilities, reported feeling an extremely powerful malevolent presence surrounding the boy, an entity that seemed to have specific and malicious intentions toward the Glatzel family. But who exactly was Arne Cheyenne Johnson, and how did he become involved in this supernatural situation? Arne was the boyfriend of Debbie Glatzel, David's older sister, and worked as a tree caretaker and gardener in the area. He was known for being a hard-working, responsible young man with no criminal record, someone who had never shown signs of violence or aggressive behavior. His relationship with Debbie was solid, and they had plans to marry soon, living together in a small house they rented in Brookfield. Arne's presence during the supernatural events affecting David wasn't casual, as he had been present during several of the boy's possession episodes and had been a direct witness to phenomena that defied any rational explanation. During one of the most intense exorcism sessions, Arne did something that would change his life forever and have tragic consequences that no one could have foreseen. David Glatzel's exorcism took place over several days in July 1980, with the participation of several priests and supervision by the Warrens. During one of these sessions, while David was writhing violently and screaming in unknown languages, Arnie Johnson, moved by love for his future sister-in-law and desperation at seeing the child suffer, shouted at the demon, "Take me instead of him. Take my soul, but leave the child in peace." According to witnesses present, immediately after these words, David suddenly calmed down, as if the malevolent entity had left his body, but something had changed in Arne in an imperceptible but significant way. The Warrens would later claim that the demon had accepted Arne's challenge and had transferred its influence from the child to the young adult. However, the effects of this supposed transfer weren't immediately evident, and for several months, Arnie seemed to behave normally, working regularly and maintaining his relationship with Debbie without showing signs of alteration. But on February 16, 1981, everything changed dramatically and irreversibly. That day, Arnie Johnson was in the apartment he shared with Debbie when a discussion arose with Alan Bono, the owner of the property where they lived. Bono, who had problems with alcohol, had been drinking and became involved in a heated argument with Debbie about issues related to rent and property maintenance. The discussion escalated quickly when Bono began making inappropriate comments toward Debbie, which prompted Arnie to intervene to defend his girlfriend. According to witnesses, the situation got out of control suddenly and inexplicably, with Arnie showing a level of aggressiveness completely out of character. In a moment of apparently uncontrolled fury, Arnie took a kitchen knife and attacked Alan Bono, inflicting multiple wounds that proved fatal. Witnesses to the incident described that during the attack, Arnie seemed to be in an altered state of consciousness, with completely black eyes and emitting sounds that didn't seem human. Debbie would later testify that during the attack, Arnie seemed to be a completely different person, someone she didn't recognize, and that after the incident, he didn't clearly remember what had occurred. Can you imagine being in such a situation? What would you do if someone close to you claimed they weren't responsible for their actions because they were possessed by a demon? Let me know in the comments if you believe demonic possession can be a valid explanation for violent acts, or if you think there are always psychological or medical explanations behind these behaviors. After the murder, Arne was immediately arrested and faced first-degree homicide charges. During police interrogations, Arnie maintained a confused version of events, claiming he remembered arguing with Bono, but that after a certain point, everything became blurry and he couldn't remember committing the murder. Police investigators noted inconsistencies in his testimony and strange behaviors during interrogations, including moments when he seemed to enter trance states. The Glatzel family, along with the Warrens, immediately connected the murder to the supernatural events they had experienced months before. According to their interpretation, the demon that had possessed David had fulfilled its promise and had led Arne to commit an act of extreme violence. The Warrens began documenting the case exhaustively, collecting witness testimonies, audio recordings of exorcism sessions, and evidence that, according to them, demonstrated the connection between supernatural events and the murder. Arne's defense attorneys, Martin Minella and other members of his legal team, found themselves facing a unique dilemma in American legal history. Never before had demonic possession been used as a defense in a murder case, and there were no legal precedents on how to proceed with this type of allegation. However, they decided to go ahead with this defense strategy, arguing that Arnie wasn't responsible for his actions because he had been under the control of supernatural forces at the time of the crime. The defense strategy was based on several key points. First, extensive documentation of supernatural events that had affected the Glatzel family for months before the murder. Second, testimonies from respectable witnesses, including priests and the Warrens, who had witnessed inexplicable phenomena. Third, the drastic change in Arne's behavior after his supposed offer to trade places with David during the exorcism. And fourth, the altered state of consciousness that Arne showed during the attack. The defense also argued that there were multiple testimonies confirming that Arne had experienced supernatural phenomena after David's exorcism, including extreme nightmares, episodes of strange behavior, and moments when he seemed to be talking to invisible entities. Debbie Glatzel testified that on several occasions she had found Arne in trance states, muttering in languages he didn't know and showing knowledge about topics he had never studied. The defense team also presented medical evidence showing that Arne had no history of mental illness nor had shown signs of psychological disorders before the events related to David's exorcism. Psychiatric examinations performed after the murder revealed no evidence of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or any other mental condition that could explain his violent behavior. However, the prosecution had a completely different perspective on the case. The prosecutors argued that the allegation of demonic possession was simply a desperate strategy to avoid responsibility for a brutal and premeditated crime. According to their version, Arne had murdered Alan Bono during an argument about rent and had invented the possession story to generate sympathy and confusion in the jury. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Arne had had previous conflicts with Bono related to rent and living conditions on the property. They also argued that Bono's alcohol consumption had escalated the situation, but that this didn't justify the use of lethal force. The prosecutors maintained that Arne had acted with full consciousness of his actions and had chosen to use a lethal weapon during the confrontation. What do you think about this legal dilemma? Do you believe the judicial system should consider supernatural explanations for criminal acts, or do you think it should always be based solely on scientific and medical evidence? Your opinion is important, so share it in the comments and don't forget to like the video if this story is keeping you in suspense. Arne Johnson's trial became an unprecedented media spectacle, attracting attention from national and international media outlets. Journalists, paranormal researchers, skeptics, and the curious arrived in Brookfield to closely follow a case that challenged the established norms of the judicial system. Judge Robert Callahan, who presided over the case, found himself in an extremely difficult position, as he had to determine whether he would allow the defense to present evidence related to supernatural phenomena in a court of justice. During preliminary hearings, the defense attempted to present the Warrens as expert witnesses in paranormal phenomena, as well as seeking to introduce audio recordings of exorcism sessions and testimonies from priests who had participated in the rituals. However, Judge Callahan faced a fundamental dilemma. How could a secular court evaluate supernatural allegations using traditional legal standards based on empirical evidence? Legal arguments centered on questions of precedent, admissibility of evidence, and the limits of the judicial system to address allegations that go beyond the conventional scientific realm. The defense argued that denying the opportunity to present their complete case violated Arne's constitutional rights to adequate defense, while the prosecution maintained that allowing testimonies about demonic possession would open a dangerous door that could be exploited by future defendants. Judge Callahan finally decided that he would not allow testimonies about demonic possession or supernatural phenomena during the trial, arguing that such allegations couldn't be verified using standard scientific methods, and that introducing this type of evidence could unfairly prejudice the jury. This decision effectively eliminated Arne's main defense strategy, forcing his lawyers to completely restructure their approach. The exclusion of supernatural evidence led the defense to adopt a self-defense strategy, arguing that Arne had acted to protect Debbie from Alan Bono's threats and aggressive behavior. The lawyers presented evidence of Bono's history of alcohol problems and testimonies about his erratic and potentially threatening behavior toward Debbie in the past. However, this new strategy had its own limitations, as witnesses confirmed that although Bono had been drinking and had made inappropriate comments, he hadn't physically threatened Debbie nor shown signs that he was going to attack her. The prosecution successfully argued that Arne's response had been disproportionate to the perceived threat and that he had had multiple opportunities to de-escalate the situation without resorting to violence. During Arne's testimony at trial, he maintained his version that he didn't completely remember the events leading to the murder, but couldn't mention demonic possession due to restrictions imposed by the judge. This limitation made his testimony seem inconsistent and evasive to the jury, as he couldn't fully explain his actions using the permitted legal framework. The Warrens, frustrated by the limitations imposed by the court, continued speaking with the media outside the courtroom, describing in detail the supernatural events they had witnessed and their conviction that Arne had been a victim of demonic influences. Their public statements kept media interest in the case alive, but also generated controversy about the ethics of making such claims when they couldn't be officially presented at trial. The Brookfield community was deeply divided over the case, with some residents supporting Arne and believing in the supernatural explanation, while others saw it as an attempt to avoid responsibility for a serious crime. Local churches were also divided, with some religious leaders expressing support for the Glatzel family and others maintaining skepticism about the possession allegations. The media took advantage of the controversy, producing numerous articles, television programs, and documentaries about the case. Some journalists focused on the sensationalist aspects of supernatural allegations, while others critically examined the claims and sought alternative explanations for the reported events. The trial itself lasted several weeks, during which the jury heard detailed testimonies about the events of February 16, 1981, Arne Johnson's history, and the circumstances that led to Alan Bono's murder. Without the ability to present the demonic possession defense, the case was essentially reduced to determining whether Arne had acted in self-defense or had committed intentional homicide during an argument that had gotten out of control. You imagine how you would feel if you were a jury member in this case. Could you have made an impartial decision knowing there were supernatural allegations you couldn't officially consider? Share your perspective in the comments and help me understand how you would approach such a complex situation. After deliberating for several days, the jury reached a verdict that surprised some observers, but others considered inevitable given the limitations imposed on the evidence that could be presented. Arne Cheyenne Johnson was found guilty of first-degree homicide, rejecting both the demonic possession defense and the self-defense allegation. Judge Callahan sentenced Arne to a prison term of 10 to 20 years, a sentence that was considered relatively lenient given the gravity of the crime. In his statement during sentencing, the judge acknowledged the unusual circumstances of the case and Arne's lack of criminal record, factors that influenced the relative leniency of the sentence. The reaction to the verdict was mixed, with the Glatzel family and the Warrens expressing disappointment with the result, while prosecutors and some community members considered that justice had been served. The Warrens continued affirming that Arne had been a victim of supernatural circumstances, and that the judicial system had failed by not adequately considering all dimensions of the case. Arne served approximately 5 years of his sentence before being released on parole in 1986. During his time in prison, he reportedly maintained exemplary behavior and participated in rehabilitation programs. His early release was seen by some as evidence that prison authorities recognized the special circumstances of his case. After his release, Arne married Debbie Glatzel, and the couple tried to rebuild their lives away from media attention. They moved to another area, and Arne found work in construction, trying to leave behind the notorious case that had defined their lives for so many years. The couple had children and, according to reports, managed to maintain a stable marriage and relatively normal family life. However, the Arne Johnson case had established a significant precedent in American legal history, not for allowing the demonic possession defense, but for clearly demonstrating the limits of the judicial system in addressing supernatural allegations. The case became an example studied in law schools about the challenges of balancing religious freedom, constitutional rights, and scientific evidence standards in the judicial system. The Warrens used the Johnson case as part of their growing reputation as paranormal investigators, incorporating it into their lectures, books, and media presentations. The case became one of the most famous in their career and helped solidify their status as authorities in the field of paranormal investigation. The story also inspired numerous works of fiction, including novels, films, and television programs that explored the case's implications and the philosophical questions it raised about the nature of evil, personal responsibility, and the limits of human understanding. Films like The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It brought the story to a wider audience, though with significant creative liberties. The case also generated ongoing debates within religious communities about the nature of demonic possession, appropriate methods for treating such situations, and the Church's role in addressing supernatural phenomena. Some theologians used the case as evidence of the reality of supernatural evil, while others saw it as an example of how supernatural beliefs can be misinterpreted or exploited. Skeptics and rationalist researchers also used the case as an example of how paranormal allegations can influence real-life situations with tragic consequences. They argued that the case demonstrated the importance of addressing psychological and social problems using scientific methods rather than resorting to supernatural explanations. What lessons do you think we can learn from this extraordinary case? Do you think there are clear limits between personal faith and legal responsibility? Or do you believe these realms can and should intersect? I'd love to know your perspective, so share it in the comments. Throughout the years following the trial, new perspectives and analyses of the Arne Johnson case have emerged that have added additional layers of complexity to an already complicated story. Subsequent researchers have examined David Glatzel's medical records and suggested that the child might have been suffering from neurological or psychological disorders that weren't adequately diagnosed at the time, which could explain the strange behaviors that were interpreted as demonic possession. Some psychologists have proposed that David might have been experiencing dissociative episodes, complex partial seizures, or even reactions to unidentified trauma, conditions that in the 1980s weren't as well understood as they are currently. These alternative explanations suggest that the observed phenomena might have had medical causes that were overlooked due to limitations in neurological and psychological knowledge of the era. Regarding Arne Johnson, some experts have speculated that he might have been experiencing post-traumatic stress as a result of witnessing David's disturbing episodes, combined with the pressure of supernatural expectations that had been created around his supposed exchange with the demon. This type of intense psychological stress could have contributed to a dissociative episode during the confrontation with Alan Bono. There has also been speculation about alcohol's role in the incident, not only Bono's consumption, but also the possibility that Arne had been drinking before the confrontation. The case records aren't completely clear on this point, but some researchers have suggested that the combination of psychological stress, supernatural expectations, and possible alcohol consumption could have created a perfect storm that led to violence. The Glatzel family has also faced additional scrutiny in subsequent years, with some family members expressing doubts about the events that occurred in 1980 and 1981. Some have suggested that media attention and the Warrens' presence might have influenced the family's perceptions of what had really happened, creating a supernatural narrative that became more elaborate over time. Carl Glatzel Jr., one of David's brothers, eventually publicly distanced himself from the demonic possession claims, suggesting that the events had been exaggerated or misinterpreted. His statements added another layer of controversy to the case, as they questioned some of the fundamental testimonies on which the supernatural narrative was based. The Warrens, for their part, consistently maintained their version of events until their respective deaths, continuing to use the Johnson case as evidence of the reality of demonic possession and the importance of their work. However, they also faced growing criticism from skeptics who questioned their investigation methods and the lack of rigorous scientific evidence for their claims. The case has also been re-examined in the context of other similar cases that have emerged in subsequent decades where individuals have alleged supernatural influence as an explanation for criminal behavior. Most of these cases have been rejected by the courts, establishing a consistent pattern that the American judicial system doesn't accept supernatural explanations as valid defenses for criminal acts. From an anthropological and sociological perspective, The Johnson case has been studied as an example of how cultural and religious beliefs can influence the interpretation of traumatic events, and how these interpretations can have real and serious consequences in the lives of the people involved. Researchers have examined how the demonic possession narrative provided an explanatory framework for events that would otherwise have been difficult to understand for the people involved. The case has also been used to examine power dynamics between spiritual authority figures like the Warrens and vulnerable families seeking explanations for traumatic experiences. Some critics have argued that the intervention of paranormal investigators in family crisis situations can inadvertently create or amplify supernatural narratives that don't help address the real underlying problems. Do you think cases like this demonstrate the need for better integration between mental health services, religious communities, and the judicial system? Or do you think each realm should remain completely separate from the others? Your opinion could help others think about these complex interactions. The legacy of the Arne Johnson case extends far beyond the specific events of 1980 and 1981, influencing contemporary discussions on topics ranging from religious freedom to the nature of criminal responsibility. In the legal realm, the case has been cited in numerous studies about the limits of criminal defenses and the intersection between secular law and religious beliefs. Law schools have used the case as a case study to explore fundamental questions about how the judicial system should address allegations that cannot be verified using standard scientific methods. Law students regularly debate the implications of Judge Callahan's ruling and whether different approaches might have been more appropriate or fair. In the field of forensic psychology, the case has contributed to discussions about how to evaluate mental competence and criminal responsibility in cases where defendants report experiences that seem to be outside the realm of conventional psychological understanding. Mental health professionals have developed better protocols for evaluating allegations of supernatural experiences while maintaining rigorous scientific standards. The case has also influenced the development of better procedures for cases involving minors who report traumatic or unusual experiences. Modern protocols emphasize the importance of thorough medical and psychological evaluations before considering alternative explanations, as well as the need to protect children from the potentially harmful influence of adults who might impose their own interpretations on the child's experiences. From a theological perspective, the case has contributed to debates within various Christian denominations about appropriate procedures for suspected cases of demonic possession. Many churches have developed more rigorous protocols that require medical and psychological evaluations before considering spiritual interventions, recognizing that what may seem supernatural often has medical or psychological explanations. The Vatican, in partial response to cases like Johnson's, has established stricter guidelines for exorcism, requiring priests to work in coordination with medical professionals and to rule out natural causes before proceeding with exorcism rituals. These reforms reflect recognition that hasty supernatural interpretations can have serious and unintended consequences. In the media realm, the Johnson case has influenced how stories involving supernatural allegations are reported. Many news organizations have developed stricter ethical guidelines for reporting on such cases, emphasizing the importance of presenting multiple perspectives and avoiding sensationalization of unverified allegations. The case has also had an impact on the entertainment industry, inspiring not only films and television programs, but also discussions about the ethical responsibility of content creators when dramatizing real events involving human tragedy. Some critics have argued that the commercialization of cases like Johnson's can perpetuate misunderstandings about serious topics and potentially harm the families involved. The story of Arne Johnson has also contributed to broader discussions about how society addresses the intersection between science and faith. The case has been used by both sides in debates about the legitimacy of supernatural beliefs, with believers pointing to it as evidence of realities that transcend scientific understanding, while skeptics use it as an example of how irrational Beliefs can lead to tragic consequences in the real world. Decades after the events, the people directly affected by the case have followed different paths to deal with its legacy. Arnie and Debbie Johnson managed to build a relatively normal life after his release, maintaining a low profile and largely avoiding media attention. Their children grew up knowing their father's story, but the family strived to create an identity, separate from the events of 1981. David Glatzel, now an adult, has largely remained silent about the events of his childhood, choosing not to participate in interviews or documentaries about the case. Some reports suggest he has lived a normal life, working and forming his own family, but understandably prefers to maintain privacy about an experience that deeply marked his childhood. The division within the Glatzel family has persisted throughout the years, with different members maintaining divergent perspectives on what really occurred during those tumultuous months in 1980 and 1981. This family division illustrates how traumatic events can be interpreted in fundamentally different ways, even by people who lived through the same experiences. The Arnie Johnson case leaves us with profound questions about the nature of personal responsibility, the limits of human knowledge, and the role of beliefs in our lives. Is it possible that supernatural forces exist that can influence human behavior in ways science doesn't yet understand? Or should we remain firm in the position that all human action must be explained and judged using only rational and scientific criteria? One of the most important lessons from the case is the need to approach complex situations with multiple perspectives and the importance of not hastily dismissing medical or psychological explanations in favor of supernatural interpretations. At the same time, the case also reminds us of the importance of respecting people's sincere beliefs while maintaining rigorous standards for evidence in legal and medical contexts. The case also highlights the vulnerability of families in crisis, and how the intervention of authority figures, whether paranormal investigators, medical professionals, or religious leaders, can significantly influence how people interpret and respond to traumatic experiences. This underscores the importance of rigorous ethical protocols and the need for trained professionals who can provide support without imposing their own interpretations on complex situations. More than 4 decades after the Arnie Johnson case, debates about fundamental topics the case raised continue to be relevant in our society. Questions about how to balance religious freedom with legal responsibility, how to address allegations of supernatural experiences in medical and legal contexts, and how to protect vulnerable people from potentially harmful interpretations of their experiences remain contemporary challenges. In an era of increasing polarization on topics involving science and faith, the Johnson case serves as a reminder of the importance of respectful dialogue and careful consideration of multiple perspectives. It also reminds us that behind every sensational case are real people whose lives have been profoundly affected by traumatic events and subsequent interpretations of those events. The case of Arnie Johnson remains as one of the most fascinating and controversial in American criminal history, not only because of the supernatural allegations involved, but because of the fundamental questions it raises about human nature, personal responsibility, and the limits of our understanding. Was Arnie Johnson a victim of supernatural forces that led him to commit a terrible act, or was he a young man who made a tragic decision during a moment of tension and then sought to avoid responsibility using an extraordinary explanation? The answer to this question may depend less on the specific facts of the case and more on our fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality and human responsibility. What we do know with certainty is that Alan Bono lost his life, that Arnie Johnson paid a significant price for his actions, and that multiple families were deeply affected by events that continued to resonate decades later. Ultimately, perhaps the most important lesson from the case isn't whether we should believe in demonic possession, but how we can better address complex situations that challenge our usual categories of understanding. What do you think? Can the devil really force someone to commit murder? Or are we always responsible for our actions, regardless of circumstances? Let me know your perspective in the comments. If this story has fascinated you as much as it has me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications for more cases that challenge our understanding of reality. Share this video with someone who is also intrigued by the mysteries surrounding the intersection between the supernatural and the criminal. And remember, truth is often stranger than fiction, but distinguishing between the two remains one of our greatest challenges as human beings. Until next time, keep your mind open, but your critical thinking always active.